Star Wars 7x7, episode 2475. Today, the first of a two-part conversation with Edward Gross, who is the co-author of Secrets of the Force, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Star Wars. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So here's the deal with Edward Gross. He has an extensive history covering film and television as a member of the editorial staff at a variety of magazines, including Cinescape, Starlog, Cinefantastique, SFX, Movie Magic, Sci-Fi Now, and Geek. He has written or co-written over 36 nonfiction books. And this Star Wars oral history book is the latest in a series of oral histories that he and his co-writing partner Mark Altman have put together over the past few years. They have touched upon the Battlestar Galactica franchise, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer / Angel franchise, the James Bond franchise, and that other Star franchise, Star Trek. And yeah, that other franchise might come up in the conversation once or twice, but hey, you know, you don't live by Star Wars alone necessarily, but that is going to be the dominant part of the conversation naturally. And so without further ado, here is part one of my conversation with Ed Gross, co-author of Secrets of the Force, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Star Wars. Ed Gross, thank you so much for joining me on Star Wars 7x7. How are you today?
I am great, you know, immersed in the world of Star Wars and hoping the word gets out there about Secrets of the Force.
I'm very pleased to be talking to you about that today. Thank you very much for coming on the show. And oh my gosh, this immersion is crazy, but this is apparently kind of old hat to you because this is your 5th published franchise oral history, and I gather you're working on a 6th, which, you know, maybe I'll ask you about a little bit later. But I want to start out by asking you what it is about this format that you find to be particularly compelling, and, you know, maybe you share a couple of your own personal favorite oral histories out there. Could be in the science fiction area, could be entirely out of it, whatever you like.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's very funny. When the 50th anniversary of Star Trek came around back in 2016, prior to that, Mark Altman and I, my co-author, I was trying to convince him to do a book for the 50th anniversary, and he just didn't have any interest because he produces TV shows and stuff, even though we'd written Star Trek books in the past together. And then he said to me, hey, take a look at these oral histories. And he showed me 2 of them, one on I Want My MTV, and one on Live from New York, it's Saturday Night, an oral history Saturday Night Live. I read them, blown away by the format. I really wasn't that familiar with the format, although I'm sure it's been out there for quite a while. And I came back to him and I said, yes, let's do this as an oral history. And we sold it. We went to our agent and sold it the next day. And it's just a fascinating format because it's like, I'm a very disorganized person in a lot of ways. But I find like this is where I'm an idiot savant, because it's like you give me an oral history and I'm able to take these disparate interviews from, you know, 100 different people and somehow weave them into a cohesive story, putting it together. And I think that's what I like about it. It's sort of putting together a jigsaw puzzle of, you know, you get the analogy we always use is you put 100 of your closest friends in a room and have a conversation about, you know, A, B, C, or D. And then it's just everybody's different views of that subject, and you just tell a story through all their points of view. It's just so much more satisfying and an easier read in some ways. You know, it's breezier no matter how big the book is, and you can pick it up almost anywhere and just start reading. So it's a format I love, and I hope to keep doing it. I mean, yeah, we've done 6 of them actually. Star Trek, we did 2 volumes. We've got one coming out next year, and I just finished one on Stargate. So yeah, we keep cranking them out in a good way, I hope.
Yeah, so 7, I guess, then, if you're talking Stargate, I think that's the new one that we hadn't heard about yet, and you're working on yet another?
Well, yeah, Mark and I are doing one for next year, and then I just finished one on Stargate SG-1, and we'll be doing a follow-up book to that one. So, yes, that'll actually be 8 oral history books.
My goodness. So clearly a format you enjoy.
Very much so, and hope to keep doing it, so yeah.
So, Star Wars is, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the most thoroughly documented and researched franchises out there. And considering that, when you approach Secrets of the Force, how do you do that to ensure that it's going to be a compelling addition to the existing library of reference material that already exists on the franchise?
Well, I think it's looking for the little sort of nooks and crannies, or shall we say, the corners of a galaxy far, far away that haven't been explored as thoroughly. Each one of these books, we've been very lucky to be able to cover some aspect of the subject that really hasn't been covered. Like, for instance, the first Star Trek book covering the original series. We got stuff on the 70s, the rebirth of Star Trek, basically. And we got people that we've never spoken, have never been interviewed. And it's interesting telling the story that way and finding those things that haven't been exposed before, in addition to, of course, the regular history, but with everybody's different points of view, it sort of paints a whole new portrait, no matter how much this material has been covered before. In Star Wars, there were two things in Secrets of the Force. One was the Star Wars Holiday Special. We spoke to a whole bunch of people on that one. And it was just fascinating getting the different views of what went into that and how it imploded and that sort of thing. And then there was that period after Return of the Jedi, where Star Wars kind of really was not quite a death throes, but it was really down there, pretty low. And Lucasfilm decided to start creating merchandise after a number of years where there was no merchandise at all. And I think the first things they came up with were these Bend-em dolls. Luke Skywalker Bend-em. You can pose them in any position you want, and that period, though, of how they reignited interest in Star Wars, rather, is fascinating, because really, I mean, Heir to the Empire is like the big turning point for everything, Timothy Zahn's book. So those are the two areas in this book that I find personally were fascinating and different, and I don't think people have read much on.
I agree. And the holiday special, actually, Bruce Valanche has been a guest on the show previously. It was wonderful to see him quoted in that section. And it is wonderful. And I highly recommend the read because, yeah, that is one of the most unique stories in all of Star Wars. And the fact that it has been, mostly disavowed by everyone.
I know. And this is from a company that loves to merchandise stuff. This one they've let slip by. They just don't want to acknowledge its existence.
Yeah. Hopefully someday it will be welcomed back.
If not, we'll get the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday season special next year. So there you go.
Oh, yeah.
I can't wait for it. I want to see what they're going to do with that.
So you mentioned being disorganized and how this actually appeals to your your ability to create something like this. I think it's funny to hear you talk about being disorganized considering the nature of this book. I mean, it's 550 pages long, and aside from some connective tissue that you and Mark provide to bridge from one story to another or do one set of interviews to another, it's almost entirely interviews. So just top level, how long does it take to put the book together?
These books average about a year to put together, I'd say, between saying, okay, we're doing this, getting a deal, sitting down, doing the interviews. A year is probably a pretty good estimate of it, because then once you have the interviews, of course, then it's a question of laying out all those transcripts and, as I said earlier, piecing it together. And so a year is a pretty safe number to say. It's a crazy year, don't get me wrong. But that's about it.
And roughly how many interviewees would you say? I'm not going to press you for the exact number, but I imagine it's over 100 for sure.
There's 100 voices in this book, definitely, at least 100 voices. And we kind of usually fall in that level. I think Trek was actually more. I think Trek was like 200. Battlestar Galactica was pretty much everybody. We missed a couple of people, but basically. So I'd say about 100 people.
So can you talk a little bit about the logistics of this? I mean, this is it's such an impressive undertaking to me, to pulling off so many interviews, and also the sourcing of archival interview material for people who either wouldn't necessarily go on the record, like Lucas himself, or people who've since passed away, for example.
Well, I mean, it's a question of, there's a couple of ways you go about this. With somebody like George Lucas, he did not, want to be a part of it. What a shock. But George has done enough convention appearances, live appearances, to talk about Star Wars, and some of it's like incredible. He'll spend there have been times where he spent 2-3 hours talking about different aspects of Star Wars, and it's like an astounding amount of time, seriously, to do that. In certain cases, we have an archive of interviews that we ourselves have done. Star Trek, for instance, many people had passed away, but they were sitting in what Mark calls my basement, the TARDIS. Like, every time we need something, I go down there and I'm able to retrieve it at the very last minute on the first Star Trek, or the second Star Trek book, I'm sorry, in the Next Gen and all the other spinoffs. I said to him at the very last minute, I said, I interviewed Bert Armis, and I think I was one of the few people to interview that producer. I said, I think I know where it is. And basically, I remembered it was on a black microcassette, unlabeled, in a box of about 150 microcassettes. And somehow the second tape I picked up was Bert Armis. And it's in the middle. I call him up. I go, I got Bert Armis. So it's just but that's how a lot of this stuff comes together. You get these interviews you're not expecting to get. You have things that you've done and forgotten after all these decades that you did. And I probably have strayed totally from your question. Sorry about that.
No, that's perfectly fine. I mean, you're talking about the process, and I imagine even that story, though it's about the other Star series, still kind of ports over in its way.
Well, because it's all similar. It's all the same type of thing. The process is, again, it's just being focused on telling the story usually in a linear fashion. Sometimes you bounce around in time a little bit, but it's just a question of, again, that evil word, organization, which, I have generations of my family that laugh if they hear me say the word organized. But it is that. It is just really paying attention to what everybody is saying. And as you're speaking to somebody saying, oh, okay, I got this part. And then you write it down, you put it together, and you sit there and go, I need somebody to fill this gap. You know what I mean? So it's not Mark and I talking, it's another voice. So usually, I happen to be pretty good at making contacts with people and able to go back to them. So it's like if I find I have gaps, I go back to somebody and I'll say, hey, listen, I need a gap filled in here with this. What do you have to say about this subject? And that's the way you build on what you've already got. So that type of thing.
Excellent. That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So much fun.
So in reading other reviews about the book, I'm under the impression that, as opposed to some of the oral histories that you've done, that Secrets of the Force gets more into the inner workings of the business of Lucasfilm than perhaps, say, other histories go into the business of, say, Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica, but that you're actually doing a little bit more with the company itself. I mean, would you say that that is necessarily the case? And can you talk about why the business of Lucasfilm is a particularly compelling part of the overall Star Wars story?
Well, I mean, we do to some degree with Lucasfilm. I think it's more about Lucas. I think it's more about looking at his journey. You can't have one without the other. Yes, Gene Roddenberry is Star Trek, but Star Trek is owned by Paramount Pictures and all this stuff. Lucas is Lucas, and Lucasfilm is Lucas. And so what we had to do with this one is, especially because we're covering the entire history, and I've read some reviews where people have said, "Oh, they go back and they cover, how it all started and that kind of thing." And it's like, well, yeah, because you can't tell the story without looking at how this guy started basically with nothing and turned it into Star Wars in the sense of watching. Here's the idea. Here's how he managed to somehow come up, write it. Here's how he happened to sell it. And if not for Alan Ladd, he never would have sold it. Here's how he got the rights for the merchandise. Here's how he did the special effects, had the special effects and built it from the ground up to make the effects something different. You cannot look at the making of Star Wars without going into detail on how they pulled it off, because before them, nobody had pulled it off in this way before. That's why I think it was necessary in this case to really focus a lot on the company and what went into the building of that company, because that equals the building of Star Wars.
I would tend to agree with you on that point for sure. I mean, it's certainly more identified with him and the fact that he created a company around it as opposed to other franchises where there may have been some particular creator with whom the series is identified, like Gene Roddenberry or Ronald Moore for Battlestar Galactica, for example. But it really is more of something that ultimately belongs to someone else entirely in a way, and he is deeply identified with the Star Wars stories Lucas is.
Absolutely. And one of his biographers pointed out the thing that amazed him about George Lucas is the fact that if something didn't exist, he made it. If the theaters, if the theaters didn't have the sound system he wanted for, let's say, Return of the Jedi, he made them get the equipment in because I'm going to have this neat movie, Return of the Jedi. And then later on, it was the same thing with The Phantom Menace. You should have digital cameras. I'm going to have digital Star Wars movies. So he got them to build the thing he wanted to show his films in. It's really amazing what he was able to get done.
All right, we're going to stop it right there, and we will pick up with part 2 of this conversation on tomorrow's episode. So it just remains for me to say for now, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the show, and as always, may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.